Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the show. Today is November the 2nd, Saturday. And I hope you guys are having a great weekend. Now, here's the thing. Way back. Let's open up the charts right here and take a look at what's going on here. Way back. I mean, in 1910. Now, at Jekyll Island. Now, you guys might not be familiar with this. But a group of bankers went out to Jekyll Island, and they stayed at this resort, and they hashed out what was to become the United States Federal Reserve System. Now, back in those days, the world was expanding. Industry was expanding, and these guys that hashed this out, these guys were old fogies back then. I mean, they probably didn't like the way modern people danced. They probably didn't like the way they dressed. They thought it was provocative at the time. And this was way back in 1910. And what these young people are doing, can you imagine? But they sat out and they sat around tables in Jekyll Island and they hashed out this deal to create the Federal Reserve System. In November 1910, 6 men, Nelson Aldrich, A. Platt Andrew, Henry Davison, Arthur Shelton, Frank Vanderlip, Paul Warburg, met at Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia to write a plan to reform the nation's banking system. The meeting and its purpose were closely guarded secrets. The participants did not admit that the meeting occurred until 1930. Can you imagine? 20 years later before they even admitted that the meeting ever even occurred. It was so secretive. What they were doing at Jekyll Island laid the foundation to what would eventually become the Federal Reserve System. Now, when they created this, these men could not see what would happen over 100 years into the future. Well over 100 years into the future. 110 years into the future. What we would be facing today. Because in those days, the world was expanding, industry was expanding, and the system that they created relies totally upon growth. It grows a credit system. It grows, this system that they created is like a seed, and you know how an oak tree can develop from a tiny acorn. Well, this system that they planted was like the acorn, and now it's developed into the oak tree. And the oak tree is this financial system we have today. Well, the whole basis of this entire tree that they create would blossom and grow from this, what they created, relies upon one fundamental thing, exponential growth. In other words, growth to constantly continue into the future. But the planet is not infinite. The planet, there's a limit to how far growth can go in this planet before it starts to contract. The problem is now, the essential problem that we're facing right now is we've reached the limit of this growth, and the world now is starting to shrink in its industry. It's starting to shrink in its monetary base is expanded out as far as it can expand its too. And so what's happened is the system that they created was fine back in the day when we were able to have this exponential growth. But now we've reached a point where it has to contract. And the way they established all of this, it can't contract. It basically disintegrates if it tries to contract. So it says Aldrich and Davison, the plan takes shape. Okay, here we go. The plan takes shape. Aldrich and his colleagues quickly realized, while they agreed on some broad principles, establishing an elastic currency supply by a bank that held all the reserves of all the banks. They disagreed on details, figuring out figuring out those details was desperate and a trying undertaking, he put it. He said it's a desperate, trying undertaking to try to figure out the details of all this. In Warburg's words, completely secluded, the men woke up early and worked late into the night for more than a week. We had disappeared from the world into a deserted island. Vanderclip recalled in his autobiography, "We put the most intense period of work I have ever had." So they really worked hard to develop this system. And what they developed was a system that relies upon exponential growth. So now we've hit a period in 2008. It first began. The world basically shrank. Everything started to shrink back. The economies of the world started to shrink back in 2008. And we went through a crisis period where the world started to shrink back. What they did, essentially, putting it in my own words and into a nutshell, is what they did was they expanded the monetary base through credit expansion to continue with a simulated form of growth in the world. And China helped. They built cities into nowhere. They built ghost cities, infrastructure programs, tremendous. So then, by the time 1971 came along, Nixon took us off the gold standard. Well, you know what? That didn't help things. Taking us off the gold standard removed the underpinning of the dollar to essentially a mooring of its worth to something. In other words, the dollar now, once it was taken off the gold standard, the dollar basically was not pegged to anything of value other than the dollar. It was totally by decree that it had value, starting in 1971. And all the other currencies of Earth happened to be pegged to the U.S. dollar, and so they're all floating free too. The thing is this system seemed to hold together for quite some time up until now. But always fiat currency systems always end in the net value of a currency. If it's not backed by anything, the net value always ends up going to zero. And this is because corruption enters the system, and they start to overprint the currency. And we find another thing that's happened quite recently. Since the passage of the Frank-Dodd Act, many Republicans have called for a partial or total repeal of the Dodd-Frank Act. Well, the Dodd-Frank Act, along with other capital controls that were put in place after the Great Depression of the era of the 1930s, all of these have been repealed and taken out. And so it allows the banks, along with giving the banks and the financial sector 0% interest rates, in other words, free money, that they can speculate on anything that they want to speculate on. This allows deformities in the system. So not only do we have a system that is basically floating free for the last 10 years or 11 years, it's basically been floating free, but it's also been taking on rather large debt. I shouldn't say rather large. This never been tried before, and they just keep taking on more and more and more exponential debt in order to run this system. So basically what we're looking at is a Ponzi scheme, a worldwide Ponzi scheme that's on the verge of collapse right now. And, it actually did start to collapse not a long time ago. The Federal Reserve has already stepped in. They've went into panic mode. And this is what the repo market is all about. And they've went back to quantitative easing, and they've lowered interest rates to try to stem off a systematic failure of the system like happened in 2008. It's happening right now, guys. Now, meanwhile, what do we got going on in the world? We have a generation now that basically has their head in the sand. They don't see what's really happening. My show, I'm pointing it out to you guys. You guys are aware. An awful lot of you are aware. But you're the ones that watch this show. You represent the minority of the people. Most of the people out there right now are completely entrenched in one form of entertainment or another. Even if some of them work, some of them don't work. But the ones that work, they go to work, they spend their time at work, and as soon as they get home, the little bit of time they have before they have to go to bed often involves entertainment in one form or another. An awful lot of this entertainment, a large percentage of it, is irrelevant stuff. It's stuff like the latest new music bands, or who has the craziest Halloween costumes. Right now, this is a big deal. You know, I seen a really crazy Halloween costume yesterday. You know, somebody had built this, some female actress built some sort of a weird spacesuit or something that looked like an alien or something like that. You know, and I mean, it was just absolutely over the top. I mean, they did a great job on it, but I mean, it's just absolutely over the top that made all the newspaper headlines and everything else. But this is what people are into. They're into the latest and greatest entertainment. They're into that new video game that's coming out, or whatever, right? This is going to take them, really, all these people, by surprise and shock, and it's going to be something like they've never seen before, and it's going to come out of nowhere. And what it really boils down to is problems in the credit markets and the debt market and and your corporate debt market. This whole thing's going to come out of nowhere, just like the 10 years that people went through leading up to the Great Depression. Those 10 years, the 1920s, were called the Roaring Twenties. And the reason why they called them the Roaring Twenties, people were just like they are today. They were learning the latest dance, Charleston, you know. And they were also learning different other things, like how to dress. The women were dressing in a certain way. They call them flappers. And, you know, it was extremely provocative for the day. Considering, you know, that the flappers' hair was short, and oftentimes their dress was short. They would show their legs. This was unheard of just a few years earlier. And so this was the effect of all of this wealth coming into the system that was being generated from credit into the markets. Well, we all know how that ended. It ended with the Great Depression. This time, they've really overdone it. Worse than the Great Depression era. They've overextended the whole world to the point where right now there's what they call the everything bubble. I'm afraid to say this, but there's only two directions that this can go, and neither one of them's pretty. One's worse than the other. The first direction it can go is deflation, where the central banks lose control. They don't have enough tools to fight it with, or they wait too long to use their tools, and it descends into deflation. In which case, if it goes in that direction of deflation, we're going to see basically the credit markets of the world freeze for an extended period of time. We could actually see the whole world freeze because everything runs on money, just-in-time supply. Now, I was listening to a show. I'm going to put the link in the description. And I can't dispute anything that they've said in this show. But it's frightening. I know some of you guys out there, you watch horror movies, you know. And you come out of the theater after watching one of those movies and you're frightened, but you know it's none of it's real. Nothing that you watched was real. This is real. And this is every bit as frightening as the movie you'd watch in there. Except it's a little bit different scenario involved. We're all involved in it. And like I say, there's two directions this would go. Deflation. Deflation is the worst because it's a sudden onset, and it would take the system down in a sudden way that would disrupt everything. And basically, once everything is disrupted at a certain point, who's going to restore things back once things have been completely flattened? It's just too big for any one particular grouper to restore order. That's potentially the most frightening scenario, is the deflationary scenario. Now there's another scenario that's more likely to happen than deflation. Deflation is, I'm only going to put a very small percent chance that that could actually happen, the deflationary scenario, but there's the inflationary scenario. It's just exactly in the opposite direction. And this is where it's pointing to it's going. And why I say that is we already see the Fed taking action. And this action to stimulate the economy in the repo markets is basically dumping money on the situation. They're going to, in the end, have to do more and more. And ultimately, this is going to lead to the inflationary scenario, which is totally the opposite. The inflationary scenario is much slower, but its effect in the end is just as insidious, or all close to as insidious as the deflationary scenario, because it leads to something called a hyperinflation. And during a hyperinflation that's worldwide, which is we've never seen happen before, we've always seen small localized hyperinflations, and they always reach out to something of value, another currency, generally the dollar. They use that as a means of payment, while their own currency is hyperinflating. In this case scenario, it'd be a worldwide hyperinflation where all the fiat currencies would be under the effect of it. So they'd have to reach out to, they would have to reach out to something of value. There's very few things of value that they can reach out to. And just like Venezuela reached out to the dollar, they also reached out to cryptocurrency and gold and silver. Well, of course, the world is going to reach out during a hyperinflationary scenario to these asset classes that I just mentioned, gold, silver, and cryptocurrencies. This is going to increase the value of them exponentially compared to the hyperinflating currencies. This is the direction that this is pointing to more so than anything else. And ultimately, in the end, in a hyperinflationary scenario, essential services would probably stay up and running. There would still be companies delivering food and stuff, and the credit markets probably wouldn't completely melt down. And it would, if they did melt down, it wouldn't be a sudden meltdown. It's that sudden meltdown of the system that deflation would cause that is the biggest danger, which is probably not going to occur. But still, even in a hyperinflationary scenario, the markets still have exponential problems. And the world would still have exponential problems caused by hyperinflation. It would completely and utterly destroy the middle class. And we would see an increase or an uptick in homelessness like we've never ever seen before. It would be like nothing you've ever seen before. And of course, when you make vast amounts of people homeless, of course you get problems that go along with that. And these problems lead to a shortening of the people's involved in the homelessness of their not only their lifestyle but their lives. Ultimately, it leads to an increase in diseases. Some of these diseases in the 20th century, we thought we had them under control, but in certain situations, it would allow these diseases to come back on us again. Diseases like tuberculosis. And now they have new modern drug-resistant versions of tuberculosis. Could spread rampant through homeless populations, especially if the situation gets out of hand. this is what we could be facing in a hyperinflation. Of course, this would lead to a reduction in the world's population. So I'm going to tell you guys exactly what I think. I think in a deflationary scenario, which would be a worst case deflationary scenario where the financial system basically melts and dissolves, which is very unlikely to happen because there's checks and balances there to keep that from happening. And believe it or not, the world's central banks are those checks and balances. Without the world's central banks, even though I dislike the world's central banks, I cannot express to you guys how much I dislike the world's central banks. Still, the world's central banks are here to stay, and they are the only thing standing between us and this deflationary scenario that I just talked about. During a deflationary scenario like that, I could see a 90% loss in the world's population. Quite seriously. But that would be a worst case scenario. During the world's not going to get off scot-free, guys, even if we do have the hyperinflationary scenario. But it does mean the stores would remain open. It just means you wouldn't have enough money to be able to afford to buy the food in the store. Or it would take all of your money. Quite seriously. You know? We're not going to get off scot-free. It's going to create tremendous homelessness, and that's going to lead to a decrease in the world's population as well. But I'm going to say that it would take probably 10% of the world's population instead of 90% of the world's population. It would be much, much less severe. But here's the kicker, guys. There's no way out. We're going to face one of those two scenarios in the next 5 years. And it's going to begin very soon. It's probably going to be completed 5 years from now. Because this is not going to linger out for 30 years, 20 years, or anything like that. This is going to be so severe that it's going to be over probably within 5 years. And it's going to be like nothing you've ever seen before. And this is why I do my shows on here. This is the financial turmoil that's coming. Thank you guys for listening. Like and subscribe. And give me a thumbs up. And we'll catch you guys in the next show. Bye-bye.